Welcome back to Combat Mission Fortress Italy, where we're going to take a quick look at the German Elefant tank destroyer. This was originally named the Ferdinand, so we might be hitting two letters with one stone in this video. More officially, it was the Panzerjäger Tiger (P), or the SKKFZ 184. The Elefant has an interesting history. It started life as the VK45.01 (P), which was Porsche's design submission for the hull of the Tiger 1. Ferdinand Porsche was intent on using a twin-engine petrol-electric drive, which brought a whole host of problems, and ultimately the Porsche design lost out to a more conventional, more reliable design from Henschel. By that point in April 1942, though, the Germans had already built 100 chassis for Porsche's design. By September, with Porsche not making any further progress, they decided they needed to do something with all those hulls. The space for a turret was deleted, freeing up hull room for the engine. This was moved into the centre of the vehicle and an armoured casemate fitted to the rear, mounting a Pak 43 88mm gun. The design was named the Ferdinand after Ferdinand Porsche, and 90 vehicles were complete by May 1943. These were immediately sent off to the Eastern Front, where they took part in the Battle of Kursk. Here, the Ferdinand demonstrated two key characteristics. First, that it was very effective in the anti-armour role. The Pak 43 enabled it to knock out Soviet tanks at very long ranges, and the thick frontal armour allowed it to shrug off a lot of incoming fire. Second, that the design needed improvements. There were a lot of problems with the engine and the suspension, the vehicles were prone to breakdowns, maintenance was slow and difficult. Tactically, the Ferdinands had limited visibility and no weapons for close-in defence, which, when combined with the fixed casemate instead of a turret, made them vulnerable if the enemy was able to close the distance or ambush them from the flank or rear. A situation that was relatively common at Kursk because the Germans were using the Ferdinands as spearhead breakthrough tanks. The Germans sought to overcome these problems in December 43 and January 44, recalling all the surviving Ferdinands from the front and making an effort to upgrade them. Amongst other things, the engine grills were improved to help protect the engine from shrapnel and water that tended to short-circuit the electrics, a ball-mounted machine gun was added for the co-driver, and the commander got a cupola. The Ferdinand went on to fight in Italy and back on the Eastern Front, being fairly arbitrarily renamed the Elefant in May 44. In combat mission, they're only available in Fortress Italy from February to April 1944. I had a good look for them in Red Thunder, but couldn't find them. They were rare vehicles, only about 90 were ever built, and they were only ever used by 2 units. That brings us to our Elefant in-game. Starting out at the front of the vehicle, we obviously have a lot of armour plating on the hull front. This is poorly sloped, but 200mm thick, making the front hull of the Elefant a very difficult proposition for most Allied anti-tank weapons. Allied 6-pounder and 75mm guns will bounce off at 500 metres. Higher calibers like the 17-pounder 3-inch and 76mm might cause some spalling at the same distance if you're lucky. Likewise, heat warheads from bazookas and Piats pretty much just scratch the paint. This is just from the front though. As you might expect, the side armour offers significantly less protection, and at that 500-metre mark, all the usual Allied AT weapons will ruin the Ferdinand's day. Moving up from those armour plates, we have the driver on the vehicle's left, underneath these 3 hatch-mounted periscopes. Next to him, we've got the assistant driver, who has a ball-mounted machine gun with 600 rounds, and responsibility for manning the radio. He's got the antenna right there next to him. Both the driver and assistant driver originally had supplementary vision slits in the angled corners of the hull, but these were welded closed when the Ferdinands were upgraded. Immediately behind the hull crew, we have the engine. As usual, this is given away by all the vents and grills. Running the Elefant through our vehicle mobility test for some arbitrary numbers, it comes out with 830 points. That's pretty much exactly halfway between the 780 points of the Marder III, which we could peg as a light tank destroyer, and the 251 half-track sitting at 890. This is honestly a better score than I was expecting, and the reason for that is that the Elefant scored surprisingly well in the slalom. It's not very fast, being noticeably slower in all of the other tests because it weighs a solid 65 tons, but at least as modelled in combat mission it can turn very well. That's obviously something that's helpful for a vehicle with limited traverse for its main gun. One final note about the engine here: it is rather unusually in the middle of the vehicle. Engines are typically found at the rear, or less commonly at the front. Being in the middle is quite rare. In the Elefant's case, as far as I can tell, the length of the Pak-43's barrel meant it wasn't very practical to mount the gun anywhere except the rear, and the amount of space the crew needed to operate it and store the ammo meant that the engine had to move forward. Notably, this means it separates the driver and assistant driver from the rest of the crew back in the casemate. They are still connected by intercom, but there's no real substitute for physically sharing the same space. Moving past the engine, we get to the casemate. The first thing to mention here is that it really highlights the size of the Elefant. If you look at the casemate's sides, you can see that only the lower half is covered in that characteristic Zimmerit anti-magnetic mine paste used by the Germans. This isn't just on the combat mission model, it's like this on photographs from Italy as well. Presumably, the top half didn't get any Zimmerit because it was considered too high up for infantry to reach. So it's a big chunky target, and like we saw earlier, somewhat vulnerable to the flanks. The sides are pretty much bare. There are a couple of small domes towards the rear. These are pistol ports that are non-functional in-game. The rear of the Elefant has two more on either side of the circular rear hatch. I have no idea why it's circular, but it does have another smaller circular hatch in the centre, which is for loading ammunition and presumably getting rid of the metre-long spent cases from the Pak-43 when they're in action. Moving on to the roof, we have two hatches on either side. The one on the vehicle's right with the cupola is the commander's hatch. The other one is for the other three casemate crew. In the middle we have a ventilation fan. I have no idea what these things in the rear corners are. Answers in the comments. The last element on the roof is the gunner's periscope, just behind a semicircular round deflector. Obviously the gunner sits underneath this. Behind him in the rear of the casemate there are two loaders because the ammunition is so chunky. That makes for a total crew of 6. The gunner's periscope is his primary sight. There are no apertures on the front of the casemate, it's just the gun mantlet and a pair of diagonal strips running off to either side. These are basically tiny gutters. The casemate roof slopes slightly forward, meaning that rain will run off the roof and down the casemate face, onto the engine deck and down through all the grills, causing all kinds of problems with the electrics. So these two gutters are there to divert water to either side. That leaves us with the gun. As mentioned before, this is the 88mm L71 Pak-43. It's ball mounted in the front of the casemate with 15 degrees of traverse on either side. A common field modification that was standardised with the upgrade package is this plate shielding the ball mount. Obviously if that gets damaged, then the element is borderline useless. The gun itself is excellent. It will quite happily punch holes in anything the Allies can bring to bear. Shermans are vulnerable in their frontal arc beyond 2,000 metres, things like Churchills within 1,500, with the obvious caveat that spotting and hitting targets at those distances is not easy in World War II. The downside to this is that a lot of that power comes from the size of the ammunition, which limits total capacity. Each Elefant carries 40 rounds in total, split in CMFI into 33 armour piercing and 17 high explosive. And that wraps up our digital walk around. The Ferdinand/Elefant shares a lot of characteristics with other German tank destroyers. In a lot of ways, it's kind of a prototypical heavy tank destroyer, if we compare it to something like the later Jagdpanther. But it had a lot of teething problems. Especially in Italy, more Elephants were lost to mechanical breakdown than enemy action. Weighing 65 tons, they were just difficult to move, and the Germans frequently didn't have the time or resources to retrieve them. In terms of role, they definitely filled the tank destroyer niche. Excellent gun and heavy frontal armour both point towards an effective ambush predator or a long-range slugger. That said, it's easy to pigeonhole a lot of German armoured vehicle designs as wastes of resources. There's certainly an argument that the rolling investment in heavier, more advanced tanks came at the expense of more reliable workhorses that might have been more useful. But I'm not sure the Elefant actually falls into that category. Fundamentally, it feels more like the Germans were making the best of a bad job. Porsche had 100 rejected tank chassis hanging around. They had to do something with them, and they were big enough to mount the Pak-43 that the Germans wanted out on the Eastern Front. So that's a very quick once-over of the Ferdinand/Elephant. With all the German tank destroyers in the mix, that was actually a bit more interesting than I thought it would be. Hope you all found it interesting as well. If you'd like to watch these videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.